In Chapter 12, we're going to be looking at elder abuse victims. This is an increasingly important topic because we have a large chunk of our population, the baby boomers, who are moving into old age. So we have a very large segment of our population that is 60 plus and in varying levels of health. So most people that are in their 60s and early 70s um, are not experiencing abuse unless they're suffering from some type of disorder. But definitely by the time people get into our 70s, 80s, and 90s, they're more likely to be incapacitated in some manner or need some type of help with their daily living. And that puts them at increased risk for victimization. So when we're defining elder abuse is a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. And you can see that there is no age here because, again, some people in their 60s and 70s are incredibly healthy and still active and working. And then some people might be suffering from dementia or have some other physical or cognitive issue that makes them more dependent on other people. But it can come in various forms: physical, psychological, sexual, financial, or simply unintentional or intentional neglect. Now, when it comes to the scope of the problem, the World Health Organization estimates that the rate of elder abuse across Canada, the Netherlands, and the United States, Great Britain, is probably somewhere between 4 and 6% of older people have experienced some type of elder abuse. A U.S. study that was recently released found that 5.1% of adults over the age of 60 reported emotional abuse, 5% financial abuse, 1%, almost 2% physical mistreatment, and 0.6% reported sexual mistreatment in the past year. Now, here is a report that was released on crimes against older adults. Now, one of the things that is troubling about this is that they suggest that only about 45% of these crimes against older people are even reported to the authorities. So again, this would be one of those categories where we have a highly underreported number of crimes that are taking place. Especially at risk are people with dementia, Alzheimer's, again, or some other type of physical or cognitive deficit that requires them to be relying on other people, whether that's family members or workers, for their health and daily living issues, feeding, bathing, going to the restroom, things like that. So if we look at the total rate of victimization for older adults compared to overall population with victimization rates, and remember we talked about violent crime rates have been going down, and you can see that if we look at the overall population. But if you look at crimes against people who are 65 plus, it has stayed very steady. And we actually see a little bit of an increase in 2015. And since that was 5 years ago, we would probably see a little bit of an incline on that as well. When we compare rates of victimization for men and women who are older, you can see that there are variations, but overall, both men and women, older adults, are victimized. When it comes to how many of these cases are actually reported to the police, about 45%, it's estimated, of 240,000 people who are victimized each year are reported to the police. That means about 55% are never reported to the police. When we look at who commits crimes against older people, you'll see that it's often a family member. So we'll look at that a little bit closer. It could be a friend, acquaintance, children, grandchildren, other relative, stranger, and then unknown. So there are different types of offenders that victimize older people, and you'll probably be very disturbed to hear that the vast majority of people who abuse older adults are actually family members, adult children. And when it comes to elder abuse legislation, we have a couple of acts here. In 1987, the Federal Older Americans Act was amended to provide definitions of elder abuse and to direct the use of federal funds in prevention and treatment programs and education programs. We have the Elder Justice Act from 2010, reports on activities, accomplishments, and challenges within research of elder abuse, makes recommendations to Congress on what steps need to be taken for prevention and treatment programs, and provide states with resources, again, to prevent, educate, and increase the prosecution of those who mistreat the elderly. Also provides victim assistance programs. All U.S. states now have enacted legislation authorizing the use of what's now called adult protective services. Remember, we talked about child protective services, but we now have in all 50 states adult protective services who provide those same resources, mandatory reporting for anybody that suspects an elder person is being abused, investigation of cases, prosecution, or transferring a case to the prosecutor's office for prosecution of cases. Now, types of elder abuse, which we talked about a minute ago, can include physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and financial abuse. So when it comes to physical abuse, let's go back a little bit. When it comes to physical abuse, that is any act of violence or the intentional inflicting of pain, whether or not it results in physical injury. Obvious forms of physical abuse for elders include things that we would be familiar with: beating, burning, scalding, pushing, shoving, hitting, or rough handling. We also have neglect. Neglect is the intentional or unintentional failure to care for or meet the needs of a dependently elderly person. So this, again, would be somebody that has some type of cognitive or physical issue that makes them dependent on other people for their care. Sexual abuse would involve all forms of non-consensual sexual activity. As with other populations that we have talked about, that can include touching, rape, coerced nudity, sexually explicit photography. Although this constitutes less than 1% of the elder abuse, it is very disturbing for our culture to think that people would be preying on the elderly. Psychological abuse. Psychological abuse is when an individual attempts to dehumanize or intimidate older adults through verbal or nonverbal acts. It can involve threats of violence or abandonment, lying, making insulting, derogatory comments, ignoring or excessively criticizing older people. And then we have financial abuse. Older adults, especially those with cognitive issues like dementia or Alzheimer's, can be vulnerable to financial manipulation or exploitation in terms of fraud, theft, forgery, taking property, money, being dishonest, writing checks out of somebody's account, stealing checks, deception when creating things like power of attorney forms. And the vast majority of perpetrators of financial abuse are actually adult children. And I know that that's very disturbing for all of you. Categories of abusive situations. So spousal violence as elder abuse. So that's the spouse of an older person instigating any type of abuse of those categories, abuse by adult children and relatives. And then so this would be the vast majority of cases, by the way. We also do have institutionally based abuse, and this would be in a nursing home or an assisted living facility, societal neglect, and then sexual assault. Now, when it comes to sexual assault of older individuals, it is usually a spouse that engages in sexual assault. But we also have find that we have some of those categories of rapists that we talked about last week with the last chapter also prey on older individuals as well. They break into nursing homes, they break into assisted living facilities, and these are places that we would normally associate older people living. They don't have a lot of people checking on them at night in these facilities. It could also be stalking older individuals to see where they live. Do they live alone? Things like that. So I mentioned that spousal violence is a category that we definitely worry about. About 58% of perpetrators of elder sexual abuse were intimate partners. Older women are twice as likely as older men to be killed by their spouses. Many became wives and mothers in the pre-feminist era. So when we're talking about baby boomers, we're talking about a lot of older women um, who may not have ever worked outside of the house, and are a little bit more subservient to their partners. Many older women have never lived alone. Again, we're talking about baby boomers here. So these women probably lived with their parents and then got married very young and moved straight in with a spouse. Many have never learned independent living skills, managing their own finances, negotiating contracts like leases, interacting with lawyers, or how to even contact a lawyer. And so they just don't know how to live alone. They've never had to take care of their own financial issues or living issues. Abuse by adult children. So we have a role reversal that happens with adult children as their parents become older and may become dependent on those adult children. Having had two parents, both my mom and my dad, developed Alzheimer's, both broke hips and ended up in assisted living facilities. We had to do power of attorneys. We had to do forms where we could sign for their medical services. I can tell you that it is, really difficult for adult children to have to make those kind of decisions for their parents. And it was difficult for my parents to have to kind of give their independence to their adult children. I mean, there's some real trust that has to take place there. So a lack of autonomy of elderly people can make it very difficult to end the abuse. If somebody's being abused, they probably don't have the resources to reach out to somebody, especially if it's family members that are abusing them. They don't know who to contact. Type 1 adult children is dependent on victim for financial assistance, housing, or other support. So these are adult children that are somehow financially dependent on their elderly parents. Maybe they're living with their elderly parents. And so they usually engage in some type of financial abuse of their elderly parents. Type 2 results as a result of caregiver stress. Dealing with and taking care of older individuals who have cognitive issues like Alzheimer's or dementia is incredibly stressful for adult children. If you have an older person who needs help with all of their daily living issues, like eating, like going to the bathroom, like bathing, like getting up, like walking around, anything like that, if you are responsible for taking care of an older parent 24/7, again, that can be very stressful. So that stress can lead to frustration, and that's where we would see physical abuse, maybe neglect, or psychological abuse. So with this, we would definitely see more of financial abuse, and this we would see more physical and emotional, psychological abuse as the result of stress. Now, I mentioned that institutional abuse does absolutely happen. These are probably the cases that we're probably most familiar with because we see, news media talking about elderly who were neglected or abused while in a nursing home or an assisted living facility. A lot of older adults are definitely abused in some of these facilities. The most vulnerable of our elderly population, and this would be people who do have cognitive issues, Alzheimer's, dementia, physical issues where they are unable to take care of themselves physically, unable to feed themselves, unable to use the restroom, unable to get up and move around. When we talk about people in their 60s and 70s and even early 80s, for the most part, people are still living fairly independently today. But when we get old, so late 80s, definitely by the time people are in their 90s, a large number of these elderly people do end up in some type of institutional setting where there are caregivers there who are paid to take care of them. 36% of nurses and nurse aides reported having seen at least one incident of physical abuse perpetrated by a staff member. And when we're talking about physical abuse, it's what we were talking about: hitting, shoving, pushing somebody down, all of those physical abuse categories that we talked about earlier. 10% of staff members admitted to having committed physical abuse, and 40% admitted to psychological abuse. Again, name calling, putting somebody down. We also have a lot of neglect that takes place. And this would be in social institutions as well. And I can tell you this, having two parents who ended up in assisted living facilities, they don't have the resources and the staff that they need. The resources, I mean, the staff are highly underpaid. So a lot of older folks there, they do get 3 meals a day, but they aren't turned on their beds, so they develop bed sores. They don't get their adult. A lot of older people end up incontinent and have to wear diapers in these facilities because not enough people can get them or help them to the bathroom. They're left in wet clothes for long periods of time, which can cause all kinds of skin issues. A lot of these facilities don't have doctors on staff every day. Doctors come in kind of on a rotating basis, so they might not get the medical help that they need right away. So we just have a lot of, in general, kind of neglect within these institutions. And as a society, we're not really great with kind of making sure that we're taking care of older people. Factors associated with being at risk of abuse as an older person: physical impairment. So I told you that people who have some type of issue that makes them need help with mobility, they are definitely at higher risk. They can't escape any type of abusive situation. Mental health problems. A lot of older people get clinical depression. That comes with losing your independence. That comes with Alzheimer's. A lot of Alzheimer's patients develop depression. That puts people at risk. Cognitive impairment, again, that would be dementia, Alzheimer's, but it could be cognitive issues or neurological diseases like Parkinson's, for example. And then lack of social support, lack of having family members monitoring what's going on in facilities, for example. So having my brother and I constantly visiting our parents while they were in these facilities, I think that made us watchdogs to make sure that our parents were not being abused or neglected in these facilities. Intervention programs, really, we just need to educate the general population on issues related to the elderly, especially with these baby boomers all moving into old age. So this is really going to become increasingly important in the coming years. We do see an increase in courses in college campuses related to elderly issues. For example, in developmental psychology, they have gerontology classes that are becoming more popular, and gerontology is looking at psychology as it's related to older individuals. A lot of medical professionals learning how to take care of people with issues related to aging. We talked about adult protective services being implemented in all 50 states, and it's similar to child protective services where we have those mandatory reporting. So anybody that is working in a professional manner with an older individual is required to report any suspected abuse of any type. So that would be doctors, psychologists, nurses, anybody working in a nursing home or assisted living facility. And then, of course, when we do suspect, making sure that adult protective services are investigating those cases to determine if abuse is going on, and if so, getting intervention programs in place to, number one, make sure the older adult is safe, and then getting them the appropriate help that they need for making sure they get into a different facility or getting them away from their adult children. We also have domestic violence programs. Remember, we talked about a large number of, especially sexual assaults, but it also includes physical assaults as well. Our domestic issues where one partner is violent against another partner. So having domestic violence programs in place that have the capacity to address issues related specifically to older adults. So they might need more help with finding housing, getting them into long care facilities, getting and really looking at both older adults. So if there's abuse going on in a home, whether it's sexual or physical or emotional, psychological, making sure that the older adults are safe, but them getting them into long-term care. All right, so this was a little bit of a shorter chapter. Let me know if you have any questions on anything we talked about or that you're going to read about in the chapter. Otherwise, have a great rest of